And as your eyes are closed and I'm walking you through a scenario, I just want you to keep track of what your brain is sending to you in terms of visuals. So close your eyes and take a deep breath and imagine you're late and you're rushing to catch a flight. You run through the airport, you get through security check, which can sometimes take long. You run through the gateway, you step onto the plane just as they shut the door behind you. You were the last to board the plane. The pilot steps out of the cockpit and says hi to you. You look down the rows of seats and everyone is staring at you as you walk towards your seat. You get to your destination, you go to a really nice restaurant, you enjoy your meal, and the couple seated next to you is celebrating their anniversary. The next morning, you go to the biggest conference of the year where an emerging scholar is presenting on their work who just happens to be one of the key presenters, and everyone is eager to work with them in the future. Now you should have a solid picture of all of that, and I want you to open your eyes because I have some questions for you. So in your mental image, was the pilot a person of color? Was the married couple two women? And did the academic look like me? It's okay if one or all of your answers are no. Your brain tends to create images of what's familiar. It's less of a fan of what's not familiar. The things I described are generally less familiar, no matter how much you might like the idea of those things when immediately confronted with them. The amygdala signals the hypothalamus to fire up the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is where the brain and the endocrine system intersect. At this point, your adrenal glands release cortisol into your bloodstream, which triggers your stress response. All of this happens in a matter of milliseconds, long before you can consciously think. I'm so happy these individuals have the freedom to be with who they love. Or it's so great that individuals can choose their careers freely. So as I was introduced to the group, I am the instructor and coordinator for the Aboriginal Health Program at the University of Lethbridge. I recently stepped into this role in the summer of 2022. And I have a Bachelor of Health Sciences majoring in public health with a minor in Indigenous health. I'm currently finishing off a Master's of Science, Health Sciences in the Health Sciences, specializing in health research. My thesis title has changed a little bit, but I'm looking at the needs of Blackfoot women living within an urban setting. I am an independent consultant and researcher. I provide bias and cultural sensitivity training within the city of Lethbridge as well as abroad. I have published with numerous journals. I think my biggest accomplishment is publishing in Rutledge. So I do have a book chapter in a Rutledge book, and I'm working on my second chapter that's going to go into a second book. I do work with McGraw and Hill. I do a lot of research within the Indigenous community, mostly within Kainai. So I am looking at supporting healthy transitions from government care. So those are Indigenous youth who are living within that foster care system and then the aging out process, and how that experience contributes to their overall health and well-being after they turn 18 or they transition out of government care. I do work with the Motugakiosin project, so that is a digital project at the University of Lethbridge. We collaborate with universities based in London, throughout the UK, Ireland, and Germany. I am part of the Blackfoot Women's Empowerment Project, and we are working with a lot of initiatives within the city of Lethbridge and supporting Indigenous women as they navigate their lives living within an urban setting. I am a Blackfoot artist as well, and I do have some art exhibits that were set to open before COVID, but because of COVID, everything has been put on hold, and we're just kind of waiting until I am able to travel back to the UK to have those exhibits. I recently won the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry for Emerging Scholar and Researcher Award. And so when we think about everything that I have accomplished as a Indigenous woman, as a Blackfoot woman, when I walk in the city of Lethbridge, people don't see this when they look at me. People see different things. Their brain, as we've seen from before, generates images that are related to me based on their built environment and what their brain has been conditioned to perceive. So going forward, we look at the parts of the brain, and there is ample evidence that when we encounter something fundamentally different than what we expect, it elicits a stronger activation in the amygdala. When encountering something or someone than what we perceive as the norm, this triggers our flight or fight response, and ultimately has helped humans survive since the beginning of time. However, in today's society, our brains still do this when encountering something that is considered not normal. Our heart races slightly, and for no discernible reason, we feel stressed out. And we can, I think, a lot from giving these talks and these presentations, a lot of individuals identify that feeling when they're going shopping. And sometimes they blame it on the lights. The lights are too hot. When in reality, their brain is seeing something that they don't perceive as normal, and it's reacting to that sight or that image. So within my role and within everything that I've done academically, I am that academic that is actively sought out. I engage in research and community initiatives, not only within my home territory, but also around the globe. I work with people in the UK, I work with people in Australia and New Zealand as well. However, living in Lethbridge and being Indigenous and being a woman, when I leave my house, I am just another individual from the reserve, not capable of achieving everything that I have achieved within my own life. So when we think about the prefrontal cortex and the brain and how the amygdala communicates with the brain and the rest of our endocrine system, the prefrontal cortex is in charge of empathy, insight, response, flexibility, emotion regulation, body regulation, morality, intuition, attuned communication, and fear modulation. And then that goes over to the limbic brain, which is in charge of our fight, flight, freeze, stress response. And it tells us to think about whether or not we are safe, or do people want me in this space? And this is where our emotions live. So when those two tend to get together and create responses to your certain surroundings, then you start to see how biases come into play. So I do have a section for thoughts and discussions if anybody wanted to discuss what they saw or their thoughts from what we've just gone through so far. And then if there's nobody that wants to add any input, we can move on to the next section. Does anyone have any comments? Okay. So when we think about unconscious bias or unrecognized bias, implicit biases, or just ideological biases, it often refers to a bias that we are unaware of. It usually happens without us recognizing that it happens. It happens automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations. It's influenced by our background, our cultural environment, our personal experiences, the built environment that we exist in, So ultimately, all of those experiences from childhood and from birth, they are conditioning our brain to have certain thoughts and reactions to certain um, experiences within society or to individuals that live and exist within that society. So individuals harbor biases even when they believe discrimination and prejudice are wrong. It is also the process of associating stereotypes and attitudes towards categories of people without consciousness awareness, which can result in actions and decisions that are at odds with one's intentions or explicit values. Because our brain makes these assumptions very quickly within a millisecond, um, we don't get to decide how we're going to react to certain things within our everyday experiences. And this can lead us to make biased and unfair decisions regarding who we hire for a job, who we serve in our organization, how we refer individuals to outside services, which treatment options we make available to clients if you're in the healthcare field, and who we welcome into our organizations in terms of coworkers. So it's important to know that unconscious biases are everyday, automatic, hardwired, and most importantly, that none of us are immune. When we look at institutional oppression, and I go through these definitions and these overviews because they're very important in when providing culturally safe or culturally sensitive resources or just engaging with that within your work field. When we look at institutional oppression, institutions are fairly stable social arrangements and practices through which collective actions are taken. Examples of institutions within Canada include the legal, education, healthcare, social services, government, media, and the criminal justice systems. Institutional oppression is the systematic mistreatment of people within a social identity group, supported and enforced by that society and its institutions solely based on the person's membership of that social identity group. So, in terms of this presentation, I obviously talk about Indigenous people and how they exist within today's society. So, the following definitions reflect some concepts used to describe the process of institutional oppression. So, institutional oppression occurs when established laws, customs, practices systematically reflect and produce inequities based on one's membership in a targeted social identity group. And this is important to remember because as we go through the history of Canada and its relationship with Indigenous people, all of those established laws were created to assimilate Indigenous people. And those are the foundational laws and practices that have built our society. If oppressive consequences accrue to institutional laws, customs, and practices, the institution is oppressive whether or not the individuals maintaining those practices have oppressive intentions. So we might want to do good within our organization, but if there are biases that exist within those policies and those practices, then it actually limits us from doing unbiased work within our practices of serving individuals or interacting with individuals. Institutional oppression also creates a system of invisible barriers limiting people based on their membership in the unfavored social identity group. These barriers are only invisible to those seemingly unaffected by it. So even though individuals might say, you know, it's hard to get these services because they don't let me in the front door, but if you are not a part of that social identity group and you go to the front door and they let you in, you're going to assume that they treat everybody the same. So when we think about our city and our town, because I do live in the city of Lethbridge, I do contribute to the economy within the city of Lethbridge. So I feel like it is our town collectively. What are some examples of institutional oppression occurring within our society? Anyone? Yeah. Mhm.
Without a doubt, a contributor to the society and the economy. And she was in a drugstore recently, and immediately she walked in, she started getting followed by security just because of her appearance. Um, um, is that an example that you're thinking of?
Yeah. So when we think about, everyday actions or interactions within the city of Lethbridge, um, I understand economics, right? I want to contribute to small businesses. I want to contribute to our existing services that exist within the city of Lethbridge, and I try to keep my money here because that's benefiting not only those small businesses, but it's benefiting our overall economy when we look at the bigger picture. Um, so I did go through downtown and I went shopping and um, I I didn't dress how I normally would if I were to be teaching at the university. I dress down. Normally I don't dress down when I go out into the city of Lethbridge because it's almost like putting on an image so that people will be more receptive to me, will be more kind. Um, but I I wore like just runners and a baggy sweater. I went into some of the shops downtown and it it was interesting seeing how people were receptive to me. And working at the University of Lethbridge, you don't really get to go shopping downtown because everything closes early and we tend to like to work late or we're constantly working, from home. So if we get time to sit down, it's usually on a Sunday. And so I made it a point to go downtown, go into the shops, and I think there was like one or two stores that were actually really kind to me. Asked if I needed anything, if I wanted to see what they had new within their shelves. There's quite a few where you have to ring the doorbell, and I had to ring a couple times so that they understood that I actually wanted to shop there. Um, and then when I did get into some of the stores where you do ring the doorbell, it was constantly like pushing me towards the sales stuff rather than really understanding like what I wanted to buy. And within society, Primaris that has taken over the mall, they do a lot of stats collecting when they look at their buildings or their infrastructures and how that's going to generate income for that company. And they realized that a lot of their shoppers were indigenous, so the indigenous population is kind of keeping that economy afloat. um, but when we come into the city of Lethbridge, we don't necessarily feel like we're keeping that economy afloat. We are, and within populations, the middle class indigenous population is often the most invisible population. People tend to not pay attention to them, and they tend to react based on what they see. So if we look at the downtown unhoused population, I think the last time they did a count, there was probably approximately 400. But if you think about the area, you have Begunny and Kainai. Kainai has close to 14,000 members, and Begunny, I think, is at 45. So that 400 is a small fraction of that total population. However, we don't get to contribute in a positive way. We have to kind of be strategic about how we go out. Everybody, um, and on the reserve, it's like a huge thing. Like when you're going to town, you get dressed up just so that you can, receive better treatment. But it's almost performative. We have to be performative when we come into the city of Lethbridge or when we go out into the town to interact with whatever it is that we're interacting with, whether we're going grocery shopping, whether we're going shopping downtown, whether we're going to go look and access services. Um, so we start to see how that guides interactions within our town. But at the same time, those invisible barriers or those, moments of oppression, they're reducing in the indigenous population to um, feel as if they're not important, to feel as if they are a burden to society. But as we start to go through the types of oppression and what cultural sensitivity is, and looking at the historical oppression that has occurred, and help situate indigenous people within this territory, I think you'll start to have a deeper understanding of why those disparities or those inequities exist within our society. So going forward, we look at stereotypes, prejudice, covert forms of oppression, overt forms of oppression. So the practice of institutional oppression is based on the belief in the inherent superiority or inferiority. Institutionalized oppression is a matter of result regardless of intent. So when we look at stereotypes and attitudes, their beliefs, their feelings, their assumptions about a target group that are widespread and socially sanctioned. Stereotypes support the maintenance of institutionalized oppression by seemingly validating misinformation or beliefs. When we look at prejudice, it is favorable or unfavorable opinions or feelings about a person or a group, usually formed without knowledge, thought, or reason. It can be based on a single experience, which is then transferred to or assumed about all potential experiences. The person targeted with this kind of oppression, they don't necessarily know what they did wrong, but it has nothing to do with them. It's based on an experience that had occurred with one other individual from that social group. When we look at covert forms of oppression, they may be secret, not openly practiced, or so subtle that they are not readily obvious, even to the intended target. The person targeted with covert oppression may not even realize that an oppressive act has occurred until after the fact, nor be aware of who committed the act. Often targets of covert forms of oppression may second guess themselves and their reactions to this type of oppression. So my experience with this type of oppression is when you do, early on in my undergrad degree and career, I started working with organizations and I started providing consultation in terms of their programs and their services. And with one organization, I think it was 10 grand or less, and contracts, they tend to pay out in lump sum payments. So when I was handed my check, the individual started laughing and had said, I'm sure you've never seen that much before in your life. And this was, I was probably in my second year of doing consultation work, and some of my contracts, they tend to be a lot. And I just laughed and I was like, oh, okay, like I really just need to get on with my day. And then I got outside to the car, and then I realized what that person had meant, that I had never really had a job. I've never been able to accrue that amount of income. When in reality, I cashed in my retirement savings so that I could go back to school, so that I could do something different. And before I cashed in that retirement savings, I was set to retire before I was 50. So looking at, just my decisions before I decided to change my career, I was set up very well. And I got into the vehicle and I went on my day. And then I thought, you know what, maybe they didn't really mean anything by that. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized like this person works with Indigenous people. This person, provides checks to a lot of individuals who are providing consultation services. So that comment on its own shouldn't have been said. It shows that, the individual thinks that Indigenous people aren't able to make that kind of money. They're not able to do that kind of work where they can engage in um, that kind of work. So after that, I left the organization and I stopped working with them, because as a person, I know my value. I know what I'm worth, and I don't need to be interacting with individuals who are going to diminish how I see myself. So I usually just walk away. So when we look at overt forms of oppression, they are open, observable, they're not secret, they're not hidden. The target of the overt oppression is very aware of the intention and action of the oppressive act and of the oppressive person or group. For example, so uh, COVID happened, right? Everybody, you know, if you had kids, I'm sure you noticed they went through insane growth spurts during COVID because they were doing so much sleeping, and they weren't getting up early in the morning to go to sports or to go to school, and then getting off of school and then doing all their extracurricular after school. So during COVID, all they did was sleep, and they grew. And we, as soon as the malls were open, all of my kids' clothes, they were short, they were small, they needed clothes to look decent. So we go to the mall, and I'm telling my kids, like, you know what? I'm sure everyone's going to be doing this, and through COVID, we all saved a lot of money. Um, so tell my kids, get your clothes. Make sure you have at least enough pairs to get you through the week, and if you need to do stuff on the weekend, go get it. Get your jackets. We needed jackets. So we went to the mall. They went and they got clothes because they were excited. They finally got to go shopping after being closed for so many months. And then we get to the till, and the person starts bringing in our stuff. They start bagging it. And as the bags get full, they go to the ground behind the person. They don't give it to us to hold. So my daughter's looking around and she's noticing that the other cashiers, they're handing their bags to the people that are buying the stuff. And she's like, "Oh, um, how come why are they keeping our bags behind the till?" And I told her, they just want to make sure that we can afford them, that we can pay for them. Once we pay for them, they'll give it to us. And she's like, "But they don't do that to any other people. Why just us?" So we told her just to wait. The cashier finished bagging our stuff. There's probably like 6 bags. Um, and then I laughed because they had to try to shove all those bags through that little cutout in the plexiglass. Um, and it looked a little bit ridiculous, and you could tell the cashier was annoyed. So as after I pay with the debit, it she starts handing us our bags, and she's waiting for the receipt to print. And then we take our bags, we go outside, and my daughter at the time was 10. And we had to have that conversation about how society is going to treat you based on belonging to a certain social group within that society. And it's hard that we have to do that with our kids at such a young age, but at the same time we have to do that so that they're aware of how society is going to treat them despite the class system that they fit within. And then Yeah, so that was overt forms of repression, and looking at the stereotypes, the prejudice, the covert, and then looking at those experiences. Are there any thoughts or comments? Yeah.
It doesn't escape no matter how high you are on the societal list. Like, uh, my great grandfather, his cousin, was deeply. He appointed Gladstone to be the senator. He gave indigenous people the vote, but he never admitted in Parliament or that influence on the like if he was 18.
If someone's closer, could you just repeat that?
Where was this microphone? Are you able to hear me better over here?
Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
that's
awesome.
a lot better.
All right. So what I was saying is that with the institutionalized racism, it doesn't matter how high up on the list you get. My great grandfather's cousin was Diefenbaker, and he appointed Gladstone to be the first Indigenous senator and extended the right to vote to Indigenous people. But throughout his entire public career, he never told anybody that he was Métis or that he was a half-breed, as it was at the time. And I always thought that was kind of interesting because my grandfather as well, he was a business owner. He owned a moving company, a charter bus company, a small farm, and whenever anyone who was a doctor or a lawyer would come up to talk to him, he always wonders like, why do they want to associate with me? I'm just a kid from Bush. I'm not anyone worth talking to, but it was the fact that that's how it was ingrained into them, into their system, that because they went to day homes, because they went to residential schools, because that was their understanding, even though they were quite accomplished people in their communities and in our society, they still felt like they weren't as good as anybody else, even though they were just as equal. I just thought it was quite unfortunate the way that the cashier treated you and your family, that's a discussion that is now forced. Like I'm going to have that discussion with my children probably in the near future because they're starting to realize those racial differences as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's something really important to note, that when individuals they start to, hear and see these types of oppression or these beliefs or these ideologies towards that social group, if you're a part of that social group, you start to internalize those thoughts. You start to internalize those implicit values or those negative assumptions about that group that you belong to. You start to believe that you're not worthy or that you're not capable of doing certain things because those ideologies or those values have been, deeply embedded within society and within your daily interactions, that you just start to believe that that must be true. Um, and then that kind of leads us into cultural sensitivity. So when I deliver cultural sensitivity training, I don't deliver it without that section that we just went through, because you have to be, in order to be fully um, in a right space to be culturally sensitive, you have to be aware of those biases. You have to be aware of those types of oppression that exist within society, and to work through individual biases. It's a lifelong um, process. You're constantly going to identify new biases. You're going to work towards understanding where those biases come from and how to unravel those biases and let them go, and then rewrite how you view that social group, or whatever that bias is towards. So looking at cultural sensitivity, it's an emphasis on awareness building in order to dispel any unconscious or implicit biases you may have within your own worldview. It begins with the understanding that there are differences among cultures, including placing value on this diversity, knowing that some cultural differences as well as similarities exist without assigning value. So placing value on that diversity, but not placing value within those similarities. It's great that those cultural differences exist and those similarities exist, but each culture is unique, and we have to appreciate that uniqueness exists within our community. And the city of Lethbridge is becoming so diverse from when I was in high school and junior high. There's a lot more different social groups within our city now, and it's exciting. And we as a community, we just have to move towards placing value on that diversity. It's also aware that people are not all the same, and that you recognize that your culture is no better than any other culture. There's a place for all of us to exist. And I think if we start to appreciate each other's cultures and each other's differences, and recognizing what we have to offer to our community, we can really build a collective community that moves towards creating a healthier environment for our children. And cultural sensitivity implies that both groups understand and respect each other's characteristics. So when we look at this iceberg and public health and health all around, we all love the iceberg. We use it for everything. We only see about 10 to 15% that is showing above the water. 85 to 90% of the iceberg is hidden. So we see style, we see race, we see behaviors, we see language, we see actions, we see gender. Sometimes age is very hard to tell with Indigenous people. But we don't see those life experiences. We don't see that culture. We don't see the thoughts and perspectives that exist within that social group. And when we look at what is below the surface for Indigenous people, the one thing that a lot of people don't really have a deep understanding of is the Indian Act of 1876, which is one of the oldest pieces of legislation to exist within this country. The document itself denied women First Nation status if they married a non-Indigenous man. It allowed provincial governments and municipalities to create reserve systems and enforce the pass system. It enforced the disenfranchisement clause, which forced First Nations people to revoke their status position when they received post-secondary or vocational training. And a lot of people, they're like, well, what's so bad, about losing status if you're going to become a contributing member of society? But I'll get into that a little bit later, why that was seen as negative. And then this resulted in forced disconnection from their community and family. It enforced the permit system, which restricted goods from leaving the reserve. The Indian Act also introduced intergenerational poverty to First Nations communities. So we talk about intergenerational trauma, but a lot of times what we should be talking about is intergenerational poverty within those communities, and how that has contributed to poor social determinants of health associated with colonization, disconnection from kinship alliances, land, language, and the history of residential schools that has just recently been confirmed through the uncovering of human remains. And I think, in just a couple of days ago, we heard about Saskatchewan and the 200 anomalies that were discovered within that area. So before those uncoverings, and I don't call them discoveries because people knew they were there, with that uncovering, it was almost as if, residential school, people kind of knew about it. They didn't think, bad things happened in these places. They seen them as good things that helped individuals achieve education so that they could leave the reserve and get a job. However, that wasn't necessarily the case. So before colonization, First Nations people were culturally distinct, economically self-sufficient. Despite their uniqueness, they shared the worldview that they inhabited a materially, socially, and spiritually integrated world ecosystem that existed in equal and respectful relationships with every living and non-living entity that was created. Many First Nations communities were matriarchal in their decision-making and everyday activities. And this is the same for Blackfoot people. Our people were very, matriarchal. Our elders and our leaders are the ones that kind of guide us through the decision-making process of anything that has to do with our nations collectively. And we rely on our kinship ties for survival within our everyday lives, within our even our work life. We may not think about it, but a lot of times our kinship ties are what allow us to exist in that social setting. First Nations women and men work collectively to ensure survival and balance within the community. And when the halves combined, that community cohered into a functional whole society. So we look at men and women, they had equal roles within not only the lodges, but within the community, within, ensuring that future generations were going to continue to exist. And then when we look at, colonization, it introduced a quantification of people's humanness and levels of civilization, which were utilized to justify the need to civilize First Nations people in hopes of eradicating the Indian problem. Populations during this time heavily decreased in numbers due to warfare and the lack of immunity to diseases of European origin. The Indian Act of 1876 resulted in many negative social, economic, political, and legal consequences, with women being largely discriminated against, resulting in displacement from community and land if they married a non-Indigenous man. And when we talk about displacement, we mean that those individuals who were displaced from their community, they were not allowed to go back home. They couldn't interact with their extended family. They couldn't step foot on the reserve, and they just weren't allowed to interact with them. They were no longer able to see their mom and their dad or their siblings or their nieces and nephews. And I don't know about you, but like if I wasn't allowed to go back home just because I got a university education, it would impact my mental health. It would impact my emotional health if I wasn't able to see, like a grandma or a grandpa. So starting to look at that in terms of what that really meant for that community. And the Indian Act also granted the federal government the ability to prohibit traditional ceremonies, specify how bands would elect leadership and administer affairs, expropriate portions of reserved lands for roads, railways, and other public works, lease out uncultivated reserve lands to non-Indigenous populations for farming or pastures. So when we look at the phases of colonization, there are 5. Forced entry into a foreign group into a territory. Newcomers impose their culture, dismantle Indigenous cultures. Newcomers reconstruct Indigenous cultures in ways that demonstrate the domination and oppression are necessary. Number 4, a society that benefits the colonizer and subjugates the colonized is established and justified. And then we have that decolonization process where newcomers and First Nations people work together to create a society that benefits both groups fairly and equally. Depending on where you sit within society and what tables you tend to sit at, we are in 3, 4, and 5. So within the university, we're constantly working to create a society that benefits both groups fairly and equally. However, when we look at certain tables or certain Sorry, my dog's just like doing her thing. When we look at organizations, sometimes they might not be in that situation. We have organizations that try to deliver Indigenous content without an Indigenous person leading that. That is not working together. That is kind of, taking an approach that benefits the organization rather than the Indigenous population that they're trying to serve. So depending on where you are within an organization, within your workforce, or if you tend to sit on boards, it depends on where you would be within this. But ultimately, we are not in one certain phase. There are certain phases that are at play depending on those social arrangements within society or those institutions. So when we look at colonialism, it's not in the past. It continues to affect all of our lives, whether it's health disparities, social institutions like the child welfare system, the education system, the criminal justice system, policing and funding practices, failure to resolve treaty claims, failure of duty to consult, colonial discourses. So those are those stereotypes, paternalism, assimilation, whitewashing of history or public ignorance, and policing and regulating spaces. So this brings us to the permit system. And I'm just being conscious of time. I know some do have to leave, and there is a second portion to this as well. But from my understanding, it will be online. So when we look at the permit system, some First Nations transition very well into agriculture depending on land quality. It produced high quality crops, produce and livestock, collective farming to share equipment and labor costs. So within this area, Indigenous farmers, they were very successful in farming the land that they did have on the reserve. But because some years they produced the high quality crops or the livestock, settler farmers became upset by this competition. So those individuals, along with many other people across Canada, they lobbied the federal government to amend the Indian Act, and it prohibited people from selling their goods off reserve. So if we look at the Blood Reserve, with the hay that goes on, they have their, oh, I forget what it's called. They send hay out of the country, and it goes to China and Japan and outside countries other than people in Canada. And there's a reason for that, because the Indian Act was amended and it prohibited people from selling their goods within the Canadian economy. So with that, it reduced Indigenous people's ability to sustain life with the limited resources that they had. So settlers prohibited from buying commodities or services. It limited cross-cultural interactions. It limited people to subsistence farming. And a couple of years ago, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago, there was this huge crisis within the farming economy where there wasn't enough feed for livestock. But it was one of the reserve's best years where they produced a lot of that crop. However, those farmers who were struggling to feed their cattle, they were unable to purchase that crop from the Blood Reserve because it's illegal to purchase from the reserve. The reserve is not allowed to put that into the Canadian economy. So most of that crop got sent overseas. And this is something that I think a lot of people within our local community, they're unaware of. They don't know that this permit system actually reduced, if not limited, Indigenous people's ability to sustain their own livelihoods within this, the local economy that exists within Alberta, or even just the economy that exists within Canada. That moves us to the pass system. So the pass system was introduced in the 1880s and enforced until the 1940s. However, there are still reports that it was enforced by certain individuals until the 60s or the 70s, and it was designed to keep First Nations people on reserves without merit. So there's a documentary called The Pass System, and this looks at Canada's unofficial but strictly enforced policy to confine First Nations people to those reserves unless they had a pass to leave, which was issued by Indian Affairs. Anyone caught off reserve without one would be jailed. So we look at this pass right here. It was provided to a man in Battleford, which I think is in Saskatchewan, and he was allowed to visit his daughter for 15 days with no gun. So if you wanted to leave the reserve to go hunting, you had to get special permission to go and hunt. But when we think about this system that was put in place, how are you going to get a job within that economy if you have to obtain a pass to go and get that job or to attend that job daily? So these are my ancestors. This photo was taken in 1925. The man on the end, he is one of the cornerstones for why our societies and why the Blackfoot knowledge systems continue to exist today. And if he wanted to feed his family, or if he wanted to go to the grocery store, because remember, during that time, there was no grocery stores on the reserve, he had to get a pass to go and purchase food to feed his family. So during, I work a lot with museums, and I tend to research my own family history. And I was searching for my grandpa, and I think it was the 1960s, 50s or 60s. And I found records of him being in jail a lot. And, you know, he was involved in politics. He helped create foundational laws or policies for the Blood Reserve. And I found records of him being in jail. So I went to my grandma and I was like, Grandma, I thought Grandpa, was a good man. And she's like, he was a good man. I said, so why did he go to jail a lot? And she started laughing and she told me it was easier and quicker to go to jail than to get a pass to leave the reserve to go get groceries. And during that time, I didn't know anything about the pass system. And I told her, well, what do you mean? And she said he had to get permission from the Indian agent if he wanted to go get groceries. But the Indian agent wasn't always home. Sometimes he'd be gone for 2 weeks. Sometimes he'd be gone for 4 days. So people camped outside his home to get permission. She said, and it was just easier if he went to town, went to have a drink at a pub, got caught, got thrown in jail, got a ticket, got out of jail, and then he'd go get the groceries and come home. Because during that time, my grandpa was a farmer as well. But when the permit system came into, when the permit system was enforced, if you ever drive through the reserve and you see farming equipment that is kind of abandoned on the side and it's old farming equipment, the farmers during that time, they wanted people to remember what was enforced. So they left their equipment sitting there to remind my generation of what they had gone through and what was taken away from them when they were trying to feed their families. So that's how he was able to afford groceries. However, most people, if you didn't farm, you weren't going to be able to afford groceries for your family. So that's how those two systems coincide with each other. So when we start to think about that, we start to think about that intergenerational poverty and how that has come to exist within that certain population. Any comments or questions? So when we think about life on reserves, there was food rations. This consisted of flour, lard, and meat, provided just enough to keep people on the cusp of starvation. And if there's, people over the age of, I think, 45 and up, if you went to school in the city of Lethbridge. I don't know if there was a lot of Indigenous students going to school with you. The older you get, the less you were going to see them. But if we think about the reserve system and it being put in place, and we think about residential school, both of my parents went to residential school. And I have friends that have gone to residential school who are, I think, 4 to 5 years older than me. So that's about the age of 40. So if they were not in residential school, they were at home and they had to deal with food rations. So it wasn't uncommon for meat to be rancid even when fresh was in storage. So this means that when, reserve or First Nations families were able to get that pass system to go to the food ration house, which was located just by the college here in the city. When they were able to get that permit to go there or that pass, they were often given spoiled meat, even though they had fresh meat. So they only had enough time to get their rations and then go back to the reserve. And I remember my grandmother, the late Corolla Cathrobe, she was telling me a story because I asked her about food rations and where the food ration house was here in the city. And that's when she told me it was by the college. She told me that there was a family that had gone to go and get their rations. And she said this was just after winter. So the rivers were starting to thaw. They went to the food ration house. They got their rations. And at the end of winter, everybody was usually starving because they weren't able to hunt. They didn't have the guns to hunt. They weren't able to move freely to be able to hunt for food resources. So she said they got their food. They went back across the river because they were only allowed to come into the city for one day. And they cooked the meat and they ate it. And then another family was going to go and get their food rations, and they found that family. What had happened was they were given rancid meat, and because it was so spoiled, it had caused them to get sick. And because they were so weak from, not being able to sustain or not having access to proper food resources throughout the winter, they died. And she said, if you ever want to, you could walk out there along the river. And she told me where they crossed, and you'll be able to find this thing. It's put there to remind people about the experiences that our ancestors had to go through during colonization and, the development of the city. And when she told me that, I was working on research at the time, and I was telling her, I don't feel comfortable doing this research because we're giving these people $10 and they're unhoused. They don't have, they don't have food. I feel like I'm a food ration house giving them this $10 card. And then she told me that story, and she said, if you give these individuals this $10, what are they going to do with it? So I walked away from the research project, and I'm very ethical when it comes to my own process and getting involved with research. So I walked away from that project, and it was that story that helped me make my decision in what I was going to do next in my life. So we look at life on the reserves during that time too. There's low quality housing, dirt floors, no running water. Some families forced into new housing from healthier, more rustic conditions. So that would have been like the teepee dwellings or the lodges. And then because they were confined to that one space, and there's no family planning involved either, they were now becoming over capacity within those houses. So you had multiple people living in homes which were meant for that nuclear family. So, and the houses were cheaply built. The government goes with the lowest bid typically in order to save money on their end. And then both cultural knowledge, family relationships, and spirituality were still intact until residential schools expanded. Forced relocation for some communities in the 50s and 60s onto poor quality lands for hydroelectric development. And we see this occurring within like northern communities where they were displaced from their traditional territory into places which were uninhabitable and people don't want to live there. And then we go on to enfranchisement. So enfranchisement, this was an actual poster that was discovered. So if you read it, it says enfranchisement, you too can become a citizen of Canada, vote, become a landowner, do business with other Canadians, become almost as civilized as the white man, apply today, contact your Indian agent. But wait, there's more. If you join the military, complete a university degree, or leave your reserve too long, you will be enfranchised automatically. Tell your women too, they can receive the honor of enfranchisement. All they need to do is marry a white man or wait until their Indian man dies. So women became property of men during colonization, and in order to continue existing on the reserve, they either had to be property of their husband or property of their dad. So if their husband died, they would go back to becoming property of their father. And if they married off reserve, they were property of their husband. So if their husband divorced them or left them, they would become unhoused, and they wouldn't have access to the resources on the reserve because they were enfranchised, and they wouldn't have access to resources off reserve because they were Indigenous. So you can start to see how that impacts that population as we go throughout time. So the Indian Act was amended to make enfranchisement mandatory until 1961. And the whole reason for that was Duncan Campbell Scott had said, our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. So they wanted that assimilation process to continue until we were no longer connected to who we are as Blackfoot people or Indigenous people, depending on what nation you come from. So the fine print. A legal process designed to terminate Indigenous status and assimilate individuals or hold bands. Terminate status decreases the number of people to whom the government must provide treaty rights for. And then you look at colonialism in Canada during the 1900s. You have the pass system, the permit system, women allowed to vote within their own band only, voting enabled without enfranchisement, 60 Scoop, the white paper to abolish the Indian Act, the Canadian Constitution, which recognizes Indigenous title and treaty rights, was reinstated in 1982. And then assimilation. Ideology of assimilation implicitly assumed that Aboriginal society and the culture inferior to the European and Canadian, it should give away to the latter. Most First Nations people did not want this and fiercely, mostly peacefully resisted. They were in their own home and saw no reason to give up their traditions. So they had three choices: retain culture and suffer legal discrimination, assimilate and suffer racial discrimination from European neighbors, or retain culture and try to succeed in marketplace, except government was not willing to allow success without assimilation. And you can start to see where that intergenerational poverty starts to form as we go throughout that timeline. And I think this is where we might need to end because it's almost 1:30. I think I was only set to go to 1:30. Any comments or thoughts?
Later, there I go, really loud. There's so much to think about. So given that we are against a fairly rigid time limit, I'm going to just end today by thanking you so very much for sharing this information with us. And I'm super excited for next month's session. So thank you very much for this, Melissa. It's very thought-provoking.
Yeah, and I think when I come back next month, it's something to kind of think about. It's something that has contributed to the determinants of health for Indigenous people, so that we can really understand how this current crisis has come to exist within our city, or just looking at the relational aspect of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and how we can move forward collectively to strengthen and build those relationships going forward.